What is up, you guys? Welcome back to Tidal Gardens. This video is a troubleshooting guide for Acropora. Acropora are one of the most challenging corals that is attempted by the largest number of people. There are more difficult corals, but they're fringe niche type projects. Acros, very mainstream, possibly the most popular SPS coral, and can be frustrating beyond measure. Hopefully this video will help you tackle some of the major issues with keeping acros. I've grouped the most common issues into 6 general categories. The first one is just on intake and acquisition of the acros themselves. Second, lighting issues. Third, flow issues. Fourth, chemical issues. Fifth, diseases. And lastly, pests. So let's hop right into it. It's important to differentiate whether Acropora are aquacultured or whether they're freshly imported, because those two things are very different corals. They might eventually be the same coral, but on intake, vastly different challenges. An aquacultured piece is going to be significantly more resistant than a piece that has been in transit from overseas. Having at least a year in an aquarium gives these corals an opportunity to adjust to artificial lights, artificial salt mixes, all the things. And especially if it's been propagated, we're talking about a coral that is already growing. Coming in fresh from the wild, none of that stuff is there. It's completely disjointed, and not all of them survive the transition process into home aquariums. Shipping corals, shipping an acro is potentially the most stressful thing you can ever do for this coral. They are naturally sensitive. I often joke that purchasing high-end acros is one of the most frustrating processes in this hobby. Because when you're ordering a coral online, they look fantastic in photos. What you will actually get in the mail tends to be sometimes a browned out gray colony or frag. And you might think, this is not what I ordered, but it is. That coral might have been peak show quality when it went into that bag. And in 24 hours, it turned brown, and it will take you possibly up to a month to have it regain its coloration, if it regains its coloration at all, because so much of acros depends on your husbandry skills and the quality of your tank. There's simply no guarantees that this will be a successful experience for you. One of the best kept secrets in this hobby is just how difficult it is to color up acros. There are so many great examples of super high-end aquariums with magnificent coloration, but a lot of that success is built on a mountain of failures, and truth be known, there's likely a few more failures in the future waiting to happen. It is tricky, so embrace that challenge. Once you have received this possibly down-colored coral, another issue that people have is doing something that is good, responsible practice, and that is to dip the coral. Unfortunately, dipping acros also highly stressful. So you're compounding bringing a stressed animal in and then further stressing it. By doing this dip, it's taking an at-risk coral and turning it now into a DOA issue. It would have survived just fine, but for that dip. Happens all the time. One thing that we like to do, and this is a luxury that we have because we have multiple tanks to work with, bring the corals in, give them at least a few hours to hopefully one day to relax and settle in before doing any kind of dipping. Because straight out of the container and then into a dip, it's asking a lot. Next step in the acquisition process that can be tricky. It is a really good idea fundamentally to quarantine corals. As much as people like to think that a single dip is going to solve all your problems, chances are it's really not. To completely try to exclude a pest or a disease is very challenging. So the dip, good idea. Quarantine, a good idea. But one of the more challenging things though is that a quarantine, especially if you're trying to quarantine a coral for 30 to 60 days, let's say, it might not survive. There's plenty of times where you set up a quarantine and it's not a well-established system or anything like that. What tends to happen is a mini cycle, and that little ammonia spike, that knocks down all your corals. Even though you have best practices in mind, quarantine is not a layup. It might not be a particularly stable system, and at the end of all of it, might not successfully exclude pests and diseases, which we'll talk about later. Those are the issues on just bringing acros in. That could be the root source of your ongoing issues. Moving on to lighting issues. Lighting is one of the most important aspects of keeping acros, and you don't need me to tell you that. That's pretty much ubiquitous across the entire internet. There are reasons why stickheads go really hard on designing lighting systems and spend so much time reviewing all the latest and greatest lighting fixtures. It matters a lot. I tend to think that most lighting fixtures these days are some flavor of pretty good. We use a lot of different lighting fixtures here at the farm. A lot of it comes down to how important control is for you. There's a lot of user preference. Here's some basics though. You want it to be intense enough to get peak coloration out of a lot of your acros, but there's one aspect of lighting that I think is very underrated. Lighting fixtures, as a selling point, like to talk about the footprint that they're able to cover. So one lighting fixture might say, well, because of our great optics, we can do a 24-inch by 24-inch square. Another one say, well, we can do a 36-inch by 36-inch. Cool. What that's kind of talking about, though, is you shining that light down on a piece of paper. That's not the dynamic that you're really having in an aquarium. You need to have this light kind of massage into all the nooks and crannies of an acro colony. Because one of the limitations of LEDs is like how directional they are, and where that really manifests is you get very dramatic shading, where the illuminated portions of the coral, very nicely lit. The second you get into a shadow, zero light. And where a coral gets zero light, it's inviting die-off. The way that we combat that here is we use more lighting fixtures than is necessary for a particular footprint, and we try to work in different angles of light. In the past, this wasn't nearly as big of an issue because with metal halides and with T5 lighting, you incorporated reflectors. And those reflectors, especially parabolic reflectors, gave you all those different cool angles off of that same light. LEDs, though, they have lenses and optics, but doesn't really have that same effect. So for us, more light, more lighting fixtures, more angles. I touched on lighting intensity a little bit earlier. One thing that I would suggest is be careful of overlighting a tank. While peak coloration might require very high par levels, 400, 600, maybe even 1,000 par, day one, hitting a coral with super high intensity light is a bad idea. We don't know what conditions that coral was kept in. It is far better to start off with too little light and work your way up than hitting it immediately with too much light, because hitting it immediately could kill it, whereas not providing enough light, you still have a lot of time to fix that. Let's assume for a moment that you have your angles covered, your intensity is on point, and you're still not getting quite the coloration that you're looking for. This is where the stickheads love the ability to control their lights. Of all corals, acros will give you dramatic changes in coloration depending on their conditions. And perhaps the most impactful of these is going to be light. There is a lot to be gained from tweaking the lighting spectrums and the timing of those lights. Unfortunately, I don't have great guidelines for you, but that is a point of experimentation that advanced hobbyists are messing with daily, weekly, whatever. I guess the one suggestion that I would make is to start off with a very vanilla, basic program. Live with it for a while. Understand what your corals are doing under that lighting paradigm, and then make small tweaks to it and let it sit. Make further small tweaks, let it sit. It's important to get comfortable with what the possible differences you're actually getting. Changing it all over the place might be doing too much. Next up, let's talk about flow. Acros love a good amount of flow. Most of them come from crashing surf zones, and you really can't replicate that in a home aquarium very easily. I've never seen it. The best flow that I typically ever do see involves strong, randomized flow. And the most important thing that often isn't considered is that flow isn't a problem to be solved on day one. As you are a successful SPS keeper, the colonies themselves, their very growth is undermining your future success. It is very, very important to constantly look and do a flow audit of your system. If these corals grow too thick, they will effectively block the flow going inside their bodies. Their growth will stymie all the flow in the middle of the colony, and that's a great place to have a die-off event start. The best practical way that I've found to measure and monitor flow is just by pumping air into all your pumps and watching the dynamics of those bubbles. If you start to see them not really moving a whole lot around the inside of a big blading colony of acro, better fix that. Things could go downhill starting right there. All right, next up, chemistry. Acros, if everything is going well, are a fast-growing small polyp stony. Best advice anybody ever gives is chemical stability leads to success. However, the fact that they are a fast-growing coral makes the water chemistry part of it a moving target. What you're doing today to maintain water chemistry is not what it's going to take 1 month to 1 year from now. Those are very different aquariums that are going to have very different requirements. So test frequently and make sure that you're keeping stuff in range. It's not necessarily important to nail down specific numbers, but keeping stuff off of 0, for example, in the case of trace elements, keeping stuff within a reasonable range of calcium, alkalinity, and magnesium, that is super important. Give yourself a little bit of grace on that because, again, it's a dynamic ecosystem. These things are growing very quickly, and the amount that they're depleting will change over time. One thing you'll definitely need to watch out for is if stuff starts to just look really thin and drawn in and is starting to look a little bit more drab than you remember it. Oftentimes, there could be some kind of heavy metal pollutant issue going on. That's my go-to worry concern because I am assuming that at this point, you're doing okay with the basics of chemistry. Your macro elements are fine. Perhaps you're sending out ICPs. Those look more or less okay. But something is still irritating those corals. Consider doing an audit of all of the electrical devices in your tank. Possibly there's a magnet leaking some kind of heavy metal in there. Sometimes it's good to do an ICP on your saltwater container because there could be some weird pollutant going on there that you're introducing whenever you do a water change. Watch out for that because acros in many ways are the canary in the coal mine for this type of pollutant. Next up, diseases. Acros are famous for 2 different types of necrosis. There is the slow tissue necrosis and the rapid tissue necrosis. It is a complicated discussion because it's a pretty complicated microbiome issue. There could be ciliates involved, there could be bacteria involved, generally a frustrating experience. When we start to see something like this, it's very important for us to remove the colony that's dying and immediately try to cut off the healthy portions, and maybe a few of them might survive, but to remove that portion that is dying because it's not going to miraculously get better. What it's more likely to do is spread whatever contagion that it's suffering with to other colonies, and you want to stop that immediately. Especially in the case of rapid tissue necrosis, growing from a colony that the flesh is just starting to come off to a completely bare white skeleton, you're talking maybe 1 day. Don't hesitate, just get it out of there, cut the tips, dip them, reglue them. That might be your best option. One other thing to consider, what temperature are you keeping your tank at? When we start to see these sorts of issues, it's typically in the dead of summer where it is a struggle to keep our tanks below 80 degrees. In the winter, we almost never have these issues, and we keep our tanks closer to about 76, 77 degrees. There's a lot to be said for lower temperatures and fewer bacteria and pest issues in general. Speaking of pests, number 6, acros, unfortunately, harbor some of the most frustrating pests. The easier pests to deal with are the crustaceans. So those are your red bugs, your black bugs, the white bugs. Red bugs, I would say, are kind of like fleas. They might not necessarily kill a coral, but they're annoying to see. And once you see them, you can't really unsee them. The white and black bugs, those can definitely kill coral. And those, unfortunately, also are way tougher than red bugs. We use a product here called milbomycin oxime, which goes by the trade name Interceptor, and that does work very well. The online standard dose that you'll see, it's kind of geared towards red bugs. The black bugs and white bugs require between like 3 to 5 times that, and that could be a little bit of an issue. At, let's say, the 1x red bug dosage. You might have some other crustaceans in your tank, like maybe some crabs or some cleaner shrimp, and they might survive a treatment. At 3 to 5x, they definitely will not. Just for their sake, try to remove those and put them into quarantine or something. But also at the 3 to 5x range, you're now at the risk of killing some corals. So just understand that when you're dealing with white and black bugs, it's a serious problem, and even with the right procedures to treat it, your tank might not come out unscathed at the end of it. It's a very harsh treatment at those concentrations. The most frustrating pest are the flatworms. They're very tricky because their eggs seemingly survive everything, and they will definitely kill off that colony of acro, but likely spread to other acro colonies and kill them off too. They do seem to prefer certain ones versus others. If you kind of have those canary in a coal mine type acros, like one that we see a lot of is like a fox flame or a purple bonsai, that sort of thing, you'll typically see them there first before you would see it on some of the other ones. But regardless, if you have these, and by the way, if you're an SPS keeper for any long period of time, expect to have a visit from these guys at some point. They're very tricky to completely isolate your tank from, and they're pretty much ubiquitous across the industry. It's a very common pest with acros. Dipping in quarantine go a long way. See issue 1, right? But there's also ways to kind of control and manage the problem too. Certain wrasses have been found to help control their populations. Certain shrimp, like peppermints, have been known to help control these problems. And there might be full tank treatments that can be effective, like with using fenbendazole. At the time of this recording, there isn't a really well fleshed out methodology for using fenbendazole, which is a dewormer of sorts, but there are some flake foods that incorporate it, and some people are directly administering it. The method of action, kind of unknown, whether the coral is consuming it and becoming unappetizing, if the flatworm is directly consuming it. Don't know, but hopefully in the future there are full tank treatments because, again, it is very tricky to purely catch on a specific colony, treat just that colony, reintroduce it, and call it good. Oftentimes, it's not good. One other method that I like came from Joe Yaulo at the Long Island Aquarium. He has a 20,000-gallon SPS reef. What he would do is go in there with a freshwater hose, RO water, and basically spray down in salt water all of his colonies. That fresh water will knock off a lot of these problematic flatworms. It turns out a lot of fish like to eat them if they're floating around in the water. That's also a really good way to diagnose which colonies have the flatworms and which ones don't. It's kind of difficult to tell how much fresh water you should be hitting anything with. You want to hit it with enough fresh water that it's going to knock off the flatworms, but not so much fresh water that the very treatment is causing a colony collapse. Joe said that he started to do it once every few days, and then he backed it off to once every week, and now he only has to do it about once every month, and that is good enough for him to keep that entire issue under control. So that's something to consider as well. All right, guys, that does it for this troubleshooting guide for Acropora. Acros can be a very frustrating coral to get right. Hopefully this video has given you some insight on some potential remedies. Until next time, happy reefing.